Hi, welcome to Be with the Word. This is our Souls and Hearts show where we reflect on the Sunday readings and we reflect from a psychological perspective. And this is the week that is the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And we hope that you will either do those readings or go back and listen to us on Hear the Word, where we do read them to you. And then come on over here and join our discussion. I'm Dr. Gerry Crete. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Atlanta, Georgia. And I am here with my good guest. Oh, not my good guest, my good co-host, Dr. Peter
I'm glad I'm a good
Malinowski.
guest. I'm Dr. Peter Malinowski. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a clinical psychologist in Indianapolis, Indiana. So
Yeah. Great to see you, Dr. Peter.
it's good to be with you, Dr. Gerry.
We have an interesting topic because you named it, but it's blind spots can be deadly.
Yes.
You want to say something
Deadly.
about that?
Yeah. I was really struck by the gospel, and I was thinking about this whole way that we misperceive things. As a psychologist, I'm really interested in perceptions and how we construct meaning and how we interpret our experiences. And I was like, that's what just leapt out at me in these readings today, Dr. Jerry.
Wow.
So,
All right.
yeah.
No, looks really interesting. I was moved also by that, but I was thinking about the amazing messages that come both in the first reading in Isaiah and then you get the alluded to in the gospel as well.
Right,
Oh, well, in the Psalms about
right.
the abundance and the joy and the bountifulness of God's providence and what He has in store for us.
Yeah, well, so what words? I'm always really interested in what words grab people. So like if you go to that first reading, like just give me a word that you like focused in on. What got it for
I said it funny when I first read it on Hear the Word because I said choicey and
you?
I corrected myself. So I apologize for that. But we didn't have time to go back and edit that. But the word is choice wines. And
Choice wines.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I think of wine, especially in those times, as being, well, they might have been common enough in terms of people drank wine commonly, but
Hmm.
choice. So, in other
Hmm.
words, the very best, so it's not like the $3.99 special. It's
Not three
the
buck chuck, right? Yeah.
$200 bottle of wine, right? Like it's the really nice stuff.
Yeah, well, that's consistent with our Lord, right? At the wedding at Cana, when he changed the water into wine for his very first miracle at the request of his mother, of Our Dear Lady. The steward was amazed at the quality of the wine. And
Yeah.
he said, "You've kept the good vintage for now." It's like, wow, right?
And
So,
and what hits me there, even from a psychological perspective and a clinical perspective, is that people come in, whether they believe it or not, in their heads, they come in believing they're less than and they're not good enough. That's my experience over and over with people. And deep down, if you knew me, you wouldn't really want me. You wouldn't value me. You wouldn't, I would be seen as bad. And yet, here in this passage, and then again in the Psalms, like we get this message: no, God wants the best for us.
the
He
very
doesn't pull
best,
out the choice wine for someone he's disgusted with.
right? Well, I was just thinking too, even people that do come in and seem like they are very full of themselves, what we might think of as narcissistic types of personalities, that's all compensatory. When you run into somebody that is making themselves all that in a bag of chips, really inflating themselves, that is a defense against shame and inadequacy and feeling not enough. I mean, that's what people
So
often don't realize about narcissism.
yeah, so let's break that down just a little bit because I like what you just said, but people
Right.
might not necessarily get compensatory and why. So in other words,
Oh, you want me to speak English to our people, not just jargon? Is that what you're saying,
oh, just
Dr.
to make sure
Jerry?
they get it right, like
I'm guilty
you know,
again. I'm guilty again.
no, I think you should say it that way, and I think most
Right,
of our probably people will understand, but I
right,
just want to make really
right,
sure they do because it's so important. So someone who's narcissistic is extraordinarily self-centered, right? And
right,
they may come across as thinking they're all that and a bag of chips, like as you
right.
said, right? And so, but why are they behaving that way?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the traditional psychodynamic understandings of narcissism, it's a compensation. It is uh I'm so defended against the shame and worthlessness that not only am I okay, I'm like so much better than okay. I'm great, right? And part of the reason that they have trouble in relationships and have trouble with criticism, have trouble with even, feedback that's constructive, is because if you begin to scratch that, it all falls apart, right? So there's this sense that if their self-image is compromised even a little bit, it totally collapses. So they don't have resilience, to be able to take those, to take the negative feedback along with the positive feedback.
So they're making up for something.
They're making up for something. Yeah, that's right. That's the reason. And so if I think if people could really see how wounded people who are acting in a narcissistic way are, there would be a lot more compassion. They tend to act in ways that bring on actually additional criticism, right?
Right.
So now
Right.
that's not to say that there's not vice in this as well. We don't want to psychologize everything, that including things that would be in the moral or spiritual realms. But yeah, that's often what's going on. And if people with narcissistic styles can feel safe enough and they can have a sense of their own worth, the idea is that those defenses can soften, that they don't have to be so compensatory.
I'm really curious because we're going down this path a little bit and maybe we want to veer back, but I'm curious. The topic is blind spots can be deadly. We
Right,
know that in the Gospels, there are people that just don't see, they're focused on business or their farm or something, and they
right,
don't come to this amazing feast.
right,
So, how are
right.
narcissists doing that or not doing that?
So, because there's such a focus on self protection, because they feel so unsafe, they cannot see themselves as they really are, and they cannot see others as they really are. And most importantly, they cannot see God as he is.
Hmm.
Right? I think narcissism was one of the primary reasons why the Pharisees could not see God or would not see Christ as he really was. Right? It's
Hmm.
because they were um, they were really threatened by him, and they didn't receive. They weren't open. They didn't have that receptivity. They didn't have that openness. And so there's two ways with narcissism that you can try to broach those defenses. One of them is to be very gentle and kind, and it can take a long time, years, and it might not work. And the other way that you can do it is to depth charge the defenses. It's to pierce them. All right. It's a much faster way. And you risk decompensation, which is the narcissist just totally falling apart. Or you risk, on the other end, the narcissist rising up and becoming even more vicious and angry. Or in some cases, what you do is you actually create a crisis in which they can actually see themselves more as they are and seek the help and accept the help that they need. And so we know that our Lord acted perfectly in every situation. He knew exactly what each Pharisee needed in that moment that he was dealing with, and he was pushing them hard with the hope that they would actually respond. And
What's hitting me also though is that, as you're saying that, I love that. I think that's so interesting. But you know, people can get diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, and that's the clinical level of
right.
concern. And but we don't have to even be that to have narcissistic tendencies or behaviors. Correct?
Right. Personality disorders are just an extreme end of a continuum, right? So you can have a
Yeah.
narcissistic personality style. And frankly, I don't even like personality diagnoses because I think we all have different modes we operate in,
Right.
you know? So we can have parts of us that are narcissistic, and sometimes those parts are really active and they take over, and we then act in that way. But there may be other times where in other situations in which they're not driving the bus, and
Oh,
so there's a greater openness in those moments. So I will see folks, for example, with strong narcissistic tendencies in therapy really relax, soften, open up because they feel safe. And
yeah.
that's a huge part of like marital therapy, right? Is to have everybody feel safe so those defenses, whatever they are, can be relaxed, right? So parts can feel safe.
But I think that that's really insightful because I think that can be confusing for, say, in a marital situation, like I'm working with, say, a couple, and the wife comes in and yeah, he's narcissistic in this and that way, let's say, but then he turns around and he can also be kind and compassionate
Right.
also. and
Right.
and how, it can be difficult to even make sense, but what you're saying really helps explain it, like
Right.
these different parts, so it can get more and more active or less active.
It depends on It depends on a number of factors, and a lot of it is the will. This is something that I want to make sure that is clear: is that a lot of it is our choices. Not that our choices can directly change how we feel in the moment or how we see ourselves, but we can choose to be in the kinds of environments and to receive in the kinds of things that can heal us, or we can refuse. And that's what you see going on in the gospel, right? You see a refusal. You see a
Right.
refusal of the gift. Now, it's important to remember that in weddings in these days, like in these days, they first of all lasted several days, right? So it's an ongoing event. You stayed overnight, several nights usually, and so when the summonses are going out and when the king sends out his servants to summon, these people have already been invited. This is the second summons, right? So the first one is an invitation, just to let you know. It's sort of like a kind of like
Save the date.
hold the date,
Yeah.
yeah, hold the date kind of notification. So everybody knows when it's going to happen. But then there's a second one that says, yes, the feast is ready, right? He didn't like butcher all of his cattle, cook everything up, and then say, "Oh, I should probably send out the invitations." No, the invitations went out like weeks ago. Now is the summons. And so this is the moment when people who already accepted the invitation are now saying, "No, I'm not coming."
Right. So on the surface, this is another example of the Jews missing the point, right? Because you can read it that way, that
Right.
the Jews were the chosen people, had received the invitation. Now Christ comes, and what do? They kill him, and and so now a new people are being called in, right?
Right. So that's one interpretation, right? The classic interpretation is the first summons was to the Jews, and the second summons, when you go out to the highways and byways,
Hmm.
round up everybody, that's the call to the Gentiles. That's one way of interpreting it. Yeah.
Yeah, but then there's another way, right? Like there's another broader view here that we can look at for ourselves, right? That we're being called to, that we've been called as Christians, right? And that we can get so busy with our own lives that we actually miss important moments where Christ is calling us to worship, to connect with Him, and so on.
And I think one of the things that's important to note here is that, even if we're blinded by something good, right? It's not in this one, but I think it's in the Gospel of Luke where one goes home to the new wife. He says, "I'm newly married, so I'm going to go home to my wife." It's
Mhm.
not in this version in Matthew, but here we have three things, right? We have a farm, we have a business, and we have a new wife. Okay, those are all good things. None of these things are objectively evil. Nobody is saying, "Oh, I'm going to a weekend getaway with my harlot," or something like that.
Right.
So there's different motives why people are not coming. Some of it's distraction. But I'm also going to argue, Dr. Gerry, that when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the things that keep us from relating with God, keep us from accepting the feast, right? And so I thought of things like shame, right? Going back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I can't tolerate the shame. I don't feel like I can bear to be in the presence of God except that invitation out of
Yeah.
shame.
Yeah. So really the psychological, the mental, the things inside that keep us turning away from God because we think, we misapprehend that God is going to condemn us, or that God is indifferent to us, maybe, and that we probably should just stay away.
It's probably just safer to stay away, which is suicidal. And I don't use that word lightly. Like, if we stay away from God, whatever the reason, whether that's shame, whether that's fear, whether that's anger, whether that's disappointment, whatever it is, if we choose to not be in relationship with God,
Hmm.
that's deadly.
Yeah.
That's deadly. It's deadly it's even more deadly than suicide because it's a kind of spiritual suicide that can have eternal ramifications. And
Yeah.
that's the tragedy that I see sometimes with folks who are not understanding God, whose God images are totally distorted. They're looking through these really dark glasses, interpreting God's behavior as though he were evil, really, or distorted. In fact, in the coronavirus crisis carpe diem podcast that I did a whole series of episodes, numbers 23 to 29, on distorted God images. They're all about like
Excellent.
14 different distorted God images, because if these folks knew like what the feast was, there would be no question as to whether I'm going or not.
I just had a few thoughts here, and I hope it doesn't take us too far in the field, but it maybe will help some people reflect on this because everybody's coming at it from a different generation and so on. And I think it's interesting. I feel like I'm in that funny generation, that in between generation. Like I'm not a boomer. I guess I'm what am I, Generation X? And so I feel like I have this great desire for tradition. Like I love history. I love the glory of the church. Like I love the beauty of it all. Like I love the idea of like this glorious church, and so I'm attracted to like obviously I go to a Byzantine church. I think like if I've been to Latin mass, it's like if they're singing Gregorian chant, I'm just like in heaven, right? So I have this attraction to that, and yet I kind of grew up with the hippie stuff, which actually helped me in certain ways too. So it wasn't like it was all bad. But I think about some of my older relatives and maybe even my mother here who were raised before Vatican II, but and so they got all the stuff that I might have thought was glorious, but the messaging around God, at least, I'm not saying this was everywhere, but I think it
Right.
was bigger than like a lot of people. The messages, at least my mother, my parents would have received about God would have would have turned anybody away. It seems to me some of that stuff, and I don't want to get into it all, but I think if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm
Right.
talking about. If you're really young, you don't even know. You have
Right.
no, you know what I mean? Like you might have see the stereotype of the nun with the ruler and all this stuff,
Right.
but you don't even know, right?
Right.
But I really do think they had all the glories of the church without the message of God, of who God was, in some level.
I talk about that a little bit in terms of form without substance. You can have the form, but if you don't have the love, right, that's the substance, right? And
Yeah.
so if they did find that somebody loved them in an evangelical Bible study where there was music and there was like hugging and physical contact and people
Mhm.
calling you up and seeing if you're okay, that's a huge, powerful draw, right?
Right.
Or things that lead us out of the church, right? This is where the blind spots come back in.
Yeah.
And that's where, that's why, the second largest denomination of Christians in the U.S. after Catholics are former Catholics, right? Or people that have left the faith. There's been a lot of discontent there. But if we really knew who God was, we would there would be no question about what we would do. But God allows us to have that freedom. One of the reasons that things are veiled, if you go back to the first reading,
Right.
and it talks about the 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 on this mountain he will destroy the veil that veils all peoples, the web that is woven over
Mhm.
all the nations.
That's like a misperception, right?
Yeah, I'm looking at that as being like that, like a filter, like a lens that's so distorted, like this terrible set of like glasses that distort everything. I think we wear these glasses that distort everything. I have terrible vision. I have like 2200 vision. I'm very myopic, very nearsighted. And before we had these really nice polymer glasses that you could get, I had the Coke bottle glasses, and if I didn't have them, they could really distort things. And one of the things that like people like to do is put my glasses on because everything looks super weird when you put, Peter's glasses on because is such poor
Right.
vision, right? It was kind of, we look at God through these terrible glasses because we're attributing to him the kinds of things that have happened to us in our relational histories, our attachment injuries, our relational wounds. And we talked a little bit about this in episode 29 of Be With the Word, which was on God images. It's
Right.
actually been our most popular episode.
Oh,
It's got,
good.
at least on the podcast side. I don't know about the YouTube side, um, but yeah, it's because we misinterpret these things. And so this guy shows up, because we actually do the long form, right? So we have the guy that shows up without the garment,
Mm.
right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so we don't skip the hard stuff. We're not avoiding any of that because it can seem a little weird. Like, what's going on with that?
But before we get there, I mean, I want to make this point because I do think that there are people who have gone on, like to their farm, to their business, to their new wife, and skip God, right? Skip the feast because they learned something about God in a negative way. And it might have been that maybe the pre Vatican II austerity, where there was no mention of
A
God's
lot
love,
of
or it might have
a
been
lot of
the post
Jameson and so
Vatican II lack of substance around who God was. Like, so it could be any of those
right,
possible misconceptions
right,
of who God was, which I think is to your point why we have blind spots.
right,
And they're not even, it's not even like people necessarily go out of their way to create those. They're part of our experience. So how do we, how do we do that actual blind spot check to
right.
make sure that we're not actually seeing God incorrectly?
Well, that's the exciting thing because I've got an exercise to help with that. And we'll get there. But the first thing you raise a great point that we should be thinking about now is to know we have blind spots. The guy that knows he has blind spots, the woman that knows she has blind spots, is so far ahead of the one who doesn't know,
Hmm.
right? And it takes some humility to believe that we have these blind spots, and riffing off of what you were saying, the harshest words that Jesus had in the Gospels were for the hypocrites,
Yeah.
right? Were for people that taught one thing and did another because those people contribute to the creation of blind spots,
Hmm.
right? And that's what leads little ones astray, right? Because there's an association. Oh, this is a religious person. This is Father so and so. The priest, or my own father, or my mother, or somebody else that has taken on the mantle of being a Christian, right? But who has not been very good at loving, right?
Hmm.
So those are the ones that actually caught the most criticism from our Lord because of how damaging it is to God images. That's what I think as a psychologist.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, no, I agree. And I think when people encounter Christ, they encounter not a person who has no substance, who is wishy washy, somebody with strong conviction coupled with amazing love and compassion.
right.
And
So
I wonder where we see that in the world today. Not as often as we might like. We might see a love without conviction or a conviction without love, and either one is kind of disastrous, right?
well, and if you start separating that form and substance, you wind up with radicalization in various ways, and I think we're seeing that in the polarization in
Yeah,
our culture today. You know,
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think Christ is such a beautiful example of being able to meet people where they are with
right.
conviction and love, and then transforming their hearts. And
Well, and if you see his response to the openness to learning something new, like whenever somebody asks, "Who are you?" he is like right there with them. You know, the
mm,
woman caught in the act of adultery, the woman by the well, the gentleness with which he works with people that are open to him. But
mhm,
if people have decided, no way, Jose, I am not engaging with you, whether that's Herod or whether that's the Pharisees, the chief priests, the elders of the people, he's still loving them by trying to pierce those defenses. So there are a lot of times where people have a long litany of grievances against God, but there's also, if you look at it, a long history of never being open to God,
right,
right?
right,
So it's like, I've not prayed in 23 years because I'm not praying to that guy.
right.
He doesn't deserve my love, but sometimes they still hold on to a Catholic identity, may go to mass even, and so forth. So there's this kind of
So, So
again,
how
it's
do we
parts, right? Different parts of them.
so how do we then recognize if we're holding on to a grudge against God that really isn't about God?
So do you want me to like jump into the action item? Because I'll do it right now. I mean, you're asking a perfect lead. Let's just go to the action item. All right.
Let's
So
do
this
it.
is this is what I'm going to ask you to do. Now I want you to listen to this carefully because this may for some people seem a little edgy. All right. And I want you to understand that I am approaching this as an Orthodox Catholic, but I'm going to ask this question in these words. What do I feel? That's important. What do I feel I need to forgive God for? Right? In other words, how has God wronged me in my feelings? Like that's what how do I feel God has wronged me? Right? Is it by being distant? Is it by, the miscarriage that happened 2 years ago? Is it because my father and I never got along? Is it, like what is it that I blame God for? Right? Because it's those things that are going to contribute to us not showing up at the wedding feast. We may say it's because I've got a new wife or because I've got a new, 8 new yoke of oxen or whatever it is that I need to try. But the bottom line is that I don't want to be with him. I know it's the king, but I don't want to be with him. You know what? And I can choose not to be with him. But that is essentially what hell is all about. It's choosing not to be with God. That's really how people get to hell. It's by choosing not to be with God. And most people are not going to do it out of some sort of, Machiavellian, sort of evil driven Luciferian malice. That's not how it typically goes. It goes from these blind spots that we're not willing to be corrected. We're not going to let the experience of God as he is show us something else. We're not going to go to the feast.
Hmm.
Because if we go to the feast, we're going to have to give up our assumptions. We're going to have to change. We're going to have to understand God as he really is. And there's a lot of comfort in the familiarity of the dysfunction and the disorder that we know.
So how do we get over this frustration toward God that's a feeling where we feel like he's wronged us? We're not saying God did wrong us per se, but we're just
Right,
saying that's a strong feeling that keeps us away.
right. So the first thing is to own it. Is to own that we hold these positions. And again, this is where like thinking about us in terms of parts makes sense. That to say a part of me feels this,
Hmm.
right? Because there's often another part that's like an Orthodox uber Catholic part that says, no, 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 we can't hear that. We don't really think that. We really don't think that, God. We really are not angry at you. We're really not. Like it gets really frightening to
Right.
some parts of us because we're afraid that God's gonna come down on us. And there's other parts of us, that recognize, hey, God doesn't wrong us, right? God is not unjust, right? But there's still parts of us that really hold this. What a lot of Catholics do is we try to suppress, deny, reject those those parts of us that feel this way. We, just call them the flesh, or we think it's some sort of demonic, influence or temptation or something like that. We try to get rid of all of that. And I'm going to say, no, let's own what really is true, right? Let's own what really is going on within us, what's real. Let's own it. Let's acknowledge that there's a part of me that feels disappointed with God. There's a part of me that feels angry at God. There's a part of me that feels frightened of God. There's a part of me that feels so ashamed I could never even appear before God. I'm not worthy, whatever the parts are,
Right.
right? So the way we do this is we start to ask, what am I blaming God for? Not because we're putting God in the dock and we're going to put him on trial, but so that we can know ourselves better, so that we can decide to take those things, maybe not to God right away, maybe to Our Lady, maybe to Saint Joseph, maybe to our guardian angel, so that they can be healed, so that we can at least open up the discussion, so that we can find out that it wasn't what we thought it was.
Hmm.
This is part of living by faith, right? This is part of trusting in things as yet unseen, that there are explanations for our experiences that do not cast God in the role of the villain, right? So So to do this is actually really brave work. I always admire people when they go into their systems, into themselves, and they start identifying these parts that, that are like have such intense, have such intense reactions to God. And I really should say to who they think God is.
Hmm. Yeah.
So does that make sense? I mean, like to sit down and to actually write down, I have a part of me that feels angry at God because of what happened in second grade. That year that I had Mrs. So and so as my teacher, and she rode me mercilessly while claiming to be a holy woman. That kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think some of those comes might even stem from something even harder, right? Like I blame God for, my grandmother dying, or
Right,
my parent,
right,
or for something really, really well. I mean, not that the teacher couldn't have been caused a lot of trauma,
right,
but
right.
some major loss, some major traumatic event. I think the hardest thing for people to make sense of, that most of us do kind of beat against God, right, in some way, shape, or form because of those things, and yet we don't know what to do with the negative feelings we have.
Or we think we do know what to do, which is to bury it, to try not to deal with it, to defend against it. But then you're doing the exact same thing that we were talking about that narcissists do, right? We're deliberately blinding ourselves.
Mhm.
We're deliberately blinding ourselves. And so, if we can get to this place where we are open and we can trust enough by faith, and we'll be given the grace of faith if we want it. God's not going to leave us to twist in the wind and sort this all out by ourselves. If we give him a little space to work, he'll take that little space and he'll respect those boundaries. And if we give him a little space more, give him a little space more, and this is what we are doing in the Resilient Catholics Carpe Diem community. We just put up the garden wall exercise, which is all about like recognizing that God respects our boundaries and that he'll relate with us in ways that can can be safe, right? That's what that whole exercise is about. So if you happen to be in the Resilient Catholics Carpe Diem community, you probably already know about that. But that's one of the benefits of being in that group, in that, because we're actually working with this stuff in prayer. I spend a lot of time helping people in prayer approach God in a way that allows God to show them that he's not who they think he is.
Yeah. This reminds me also, since we're plugging things, is the Be True course. Because
Exactly.
the marital course, for when somebody is struggling with pornography, and there has to be a space to let your feelings out with your partner, knowing that your partner is going to listen, care about what you're saying, isn't just going to argue every point, is really going to listen to you and say, you know what, it's okay that you shared all that, and I'm still here. And I feel like, and then guess what? When you get all that stuff out, the relationship gets stronger, And I think the same can happen with God, right? Like
Right,
he allows us the space to like get it all out. And then we
right,
can enjoy the feast, because if we are holding on to it, we're not going to go to the feast, or we're going to be there as a humbug. We're not going to actually be able to take it in.
right, right. And that was the guy that showed up at the feast without the wedding garment. Back in these days, some of the interpretations I read is that, because the king called in these folks from the highways and the byways, the poor, the people that had no substance, he provided the clothes for them. Right. So if the man didn't wear the garment, it was because he chose not to.
Right.
I mean, one of the things we as Americans or Canadians, I want to make sure that we're not all
We're
Americans. Well,
North Americans.
we're North Americans, right? We as North Americans, we don't really have an appreciation of how offensive this behavior was. Back in these days, if the king called, you went. It was like, there's like no question about it. Like if Donald Trump, President Trump calls me up, I don't have to go, right? Because he can't command me around. But in these days, if the king called, you went. And to like kill the messengers and to ignore the king. I mean, this is egregious behavior.
Mhm.
That is way beyond the pale. So there's a gross mistreatment of God, and that's usually what's going on, right? We have these blind spots. We think God has wronged us. Can we can we open a dialogue with God and bring these things to him so that he can gently show us who
Hmm.
he really is, because he desperately wants us to love, to receive his love and to love him back and to spend forever with him in heaven. This isn't, he's not like rubbing his hands together, cackling and trying to figure out ways for us to catch us in our sins and to send us to hell. Although a lot of people have parts that believe that.
Right.
Even Orthodox practicing Catholics, I see that all the
Oh,
time.
a lot
You
of
start
them.
talking with people about their God image stuff, all kinds of things come up.
Yeah. So
So
what's our item here? We're
So
having.
the action item is to sit down and to ask yourself, what do I blame God for? Okay, that's the first step, and make a list. Right, it could be a variety of different things. Right, vocational issues are huge. Right, people where vocations didn't work out in various ways. Right, you went into the novitiate, you went into seminary, or you were married. Right, and all kinds of things happened in that marriage. A lot of times that's that, whatever the stuff is that you're struggling with, to really ask the question and accept whatever comes up. It's not an issue of thinking about it. It's to ask the question and listen to the responses. Right? They may seem like they're coming up from randomly. It may seem like it's not even part of you. Some people may even feel like it's so alien that, like, why would I ever say that? A lot of times people just attribute that to Satan or to attribute that to devils. A lot of times it's not that. Sometimes there's temptations that do come from the outside, but a lot of times it's the stuff that's exiled within us. We
Mhm.
didn't even realize, right? So we want to make a list of those things that we're blaming God for, and then to take it to God in prayer,
Yeah.
right? And we don't have time today to get into all the ways that we do that, but that's a huge thing that we do in the Resilient Catholics Carpe Diem community. That's still going to be open until November 3rd. November 3rd, we close that down to new membership for a few months. So I'm really going to encourage, like, if this kind of exercise really floats your boat, consider joining that. Check it out at soulsandhearts.com. Resilient Catholics Carpe Diem. That's all. It's the community that's grown up around the coronavirus crisis Carpe Diem podcast that comes out every week. Comes out on Monday mornings that I do, um, and uh, and there's a lot of people healing from all kinds of things in that community right now that are really growing. They're really putting all kinds of effort into it. I'm really proud of them. So
Good stuff. Beautiful.
yeah. So so that's it. Does that make sense? Is that clear, Jerry? Like when I'm talking about Dr. Jerry, when I'm talking about like making a list of
I,
the things
I
we
feel
blame
like
God for and
when
then
we
taking it
write
to prayer.
things down, I feel like it helps to externalize them, right? It's like why we journal sometimes in therapy. And it really like to me, some process here to get out all of our frustrations, our resentments, our anger, the things that we're mad at God for. And that might seem like a strange thing to do for some, but get it out, get it down. He can handle it. In
Hmm.
fact, he wants to, he loves us, so he's okay with it.
Hmm.
And the purpose is to get it out so that we can then reconnect at an even
It's
deeper level.
it's
That's the
all
point.
about the relationship. It's about showing up, even if showing up and engaging with our Lord, engaging with our King, because He's going to say, "Sit down, have something." If we put our garment on and we show up, we're
Yeah.
going to be at the feast, right? It doesn't say that these people are all perfect, right? Not these people in the gospel that showed up for the feast. They were not far from perfect, but you know what? They were fed, they were cared for, they were taken care of, they were loved by the King.
And then, honestly, they'll be able to say, I shall live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, which is what
Right,
the psalm says, which
right.
is the most beautiful thing. But we want to live there free of resentment, free of all this pent up anger, and
Yep.
to be joyful. And people often say, how do I become joyful? Well, you got to process and work through the other stuff to get to joy. So,
And it's not just a spiritual endeavor. It's also shoring up those natural foundations. It's a psychological thing as well as a spiritual thing, right? We want to. That's what we do at Souls and Hearts. That's what Souls and Hearts is all about. It's about shoring up the natural foundation for the spiritual life, because grace perfects nature. So if we've got disruptions in that natural foundation, that's gonna make the spiritual life less stable, right? So we're all about helping people remove psychological obstacles to receiving God's love and to loving God and others in return, and a lot of it has to do with these blind spots. So
exactly. So, if you enjoyed this, you got something out of it, please share. let
Yeah.
people know, share it, pass it around, let your priest know. Maybe your priest, we don't mind if your priest uses it for his homilies. It's fine with us.
Yeah.
Share it with people you think would benefit, subscribe, like, all that kind of stuff, and leave us some messages. Let us know how you're, what you're experiencing, what you're getting out of it, and because we love to hear that.
Yep.
All right.
And we should mention too, like the app, right?
Oh, the
Like
app. Yeah. Oh, I
the
should say
app.
it earlier. If you're still listening, the app. So we didn't realize this for a while, but the platform we're using has an app. So if you not for Be with the Word, but for all the courses we have, the paid courses, the non-paid courses are all available on the app. So you can listen on your phone through the Kajabi app. So if you're a subscriber on soulsandhearts.com, then you can go to Kajabi, download that app, and look for Souls and Hearts, and you'll get access to all of our stuff. So
Through the app.
through the app.
It's
So
really cool. And
yeah,
that's Kajabi. Kajabi.
yes,
Yep. And if
yeah.
you're logged
Download
in,
that.
it'll actually kick it right up on your phone. It's like super cool. So,
Yeah, yeah,
all
super
right.
super cool. We're thrilled about that. We'll send you some more. If you subscribe, you'll get our weekly kind of updates, and we'll give you more information there.
Right.
I think
Right.
we're gonna have a blog coming out soon that actually
Right.
walks you through how to get access to the app, in case in case for some of us like me it could be troublesome. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and we just enjoy all of you and this Souls and Hearts community. And Dr. Peter, it's been great with you today.
It's
So,
been great to be with you, Jerry. Thank you.
until next time, be still,
Believe.
be
Be
loved.
loved.
Take good care.
God bless you all.